speak long. I'm only here to welcome all of you, to thank you for coming out tonight. It's, as you know, our bicentennial year, if you want to call it that, the town of Moultrieville. And Stella Maris, we are in a couple years going to celebrate our 175th year as a parish. And so that is pretty old for a Catholic parish in the South. And actually, Moultrieville incorporated a pretty old municipality or township in South Carolina. I'm here to introduce our speaker, Roy Williams. And some years ago, a parishioner came to me, I think it was Ann Moore, and Roy had given a talk in which he mentioned our church. And she told me how wonderful it was, and I really needed to get him to come give that talk to the men's club or some group. Well, since then, Ann has gone on to her eternal reward. The town has turned 200. We finally got Roy Williams here to talk. And the town is going to record it for historical purposes. And I'm going to sit down. Roy's going to speak from his chair, and Dr. Michael Walsh is going to show us the slides that accompany the talk. Roy is a graduate of the Moultrie High School, class of 1953. Has a long association with Sullivan's Island. Being as he's just a little bit older than I am, we didn't really interact growing up. Slight generational difference there. But he's come and gone from the island, like many people, due to necessities. But he quoted that famous saying that we all know, as we've seen people come here, they leave, they come back. Once the sand gets between your toes, you always come back. And that's what Roy's done all his life. So I thank you for coming, and Roy, thank you especially for coming, and Dr. Walsh.
Thank you very much. Celebrating the 200th anniversary. Some people probably feel like I'm almost that old. They refer to me as the island historian because I'm older than everybody else. So it puts me in a special category. But I hope you find the program interesting tonight. And I will go ahead and begin because I do not want to take advantage of a captive audience. This is the earliest reference to what we call Moultrieville. And Nick Butler, who is the historian at the Charleston County Public Library, found this reference in an issue of the Charleston City Gazette in 1798. And you will notice this part about the ville. Originally they had very simple cottages, but later on, remember, they sometimes built Italianate-style villas on Sullivan's Island. One general in Columbia even had the timbers floated down from Columbia to build his Italianate-style villa in 1853. Unfortunately, it burned in 1858. There's a reason for that ville at the end, and then, of course, later on, they drop a hyphen, and we know it as Moultrieville. The bicentennial actually was established the town December 17, 1817. And by that time, it was generally referred to as Moultrieville. And it grew up around the walls of Fort Moultrie. It was a small town, and the first election for Moultrieville was held at the Episcopal Church. And the Episcopal Church was down near the point, and it was referred to as Grace. And later on, it was then the second Episcopal Church became known as Holy Cross. But it was built within the walls of a former lazaretto, which was for the treatment of lepers when we used to have the pest houses on Sullivan's Island. And this gives you a notice of who is able to vote, all free white males who either owned or rented the dwelling on the island. And in those days, the mayor was called the intendant, and the council member were called wardens. A lot of this was patterned after Charleston, where you had wards, and so each ward had a warden. when you ask, what was Moultrieville? Originally, it was a very small little village that was built around the walls of the fort. Two themes are intertwined with the history of this area. One was for defense purposes. As early as 1673, you had Florence Sullivan over here to warn of incoming enemy ships. And another reason was for health. I mean, Charleston was a very congested place, and this area was famous for its spaciousness and the sea breezes. And remember, in those days, the horses didn't have diapers in Charleston. The original streets were laid out in 1819, very practical. On the front beach, it was called Beach Street. On the back Street. And down the middle, you had Middle Street. Some of the other names have changed, but we still got Middle Street. Station 10 was called Shell Street. Station 11 was called Quarter Street. And Station 12, where the fort begins, was called Fort Street. And the earliest Moultrieville was located from the point up and around the walls of Fort Moultrie. Gray Street was where the Episcopal Church was located. It was down near the point, not too far from where Ann Moore lived. And I think later on it was called Church Street, and it might even be called Keenan Street now. But it was very near the point. That was where the activity was. When you came to Sullivan's Island, the ferries landed you down there near the point. So that's when you came to the different taverns and inns and the churches in that area. Moultrieville, of course, continued to grow, and it was not too much later that it expanded. It expanded eventually up to an area called the Myrtles. The Myrtles was the area up there past station, today would be past station 22 and a half. After the hurricane of 1822, very few people lived there. Today, it was later known as Atlanticville. A lot of people don't realize, for many years, you had two towns on this island. You had Moultrieville, down near the fort, and in the adjacent areas, and then up past station 22 and a half, you had an area called the Myrtles. It was considered to be unhealthy because behind the Myrtles you had the marsh, and people were deathly afraid of malaria, and they thought all that marsh would help to breed mosquitoes, and so that's not an area where people lived. There were a few exceptions. Thomas Pinckney, who ran for Vice President of the United States in 1796, and lived on a plantation that still stands up near McCullochville called Fairfield. And his present-day ancestor lives there today. You also had Jacob Bond Ion, who lived up in the area of the Myrtles. Most of you are familiar with the Ion development in Mount Pleasant. That was one of his plantations. And of course, he had other plantations. You go up Highway 17 towards the Santee River. There's an area called the Ion Swamp, where he had a very prosperous rice plantation. But Jacob Bond Ion, Thomas Pinckney, and Judge U.G. were about the only people who lived up in the Myrtles after 1822. Jacob Bond Ion had been in the militia in the War of 1812, and he was very much an army man, and he frequently entertained young officers from Fort Moultrie. And the path that led through the Myrtles to his house later became Ion Avenue. This is rather interesting. Sullivan's Island, grew up, of course, within the shadow of Charleston. And there are numerous newspaper articles, of which this is only one, in which the council on the island, at Moultrieville, regulates the size of a loaf of bread. They went into great detail, article after article. And what really struck me is the bread baked on Sullivan's Island always had to be at least 1 ounce less than a similar loaf of bread baked in Charleston. And they were dead serious about this. You did not dare to violate that regulation. Apparently they hadn't heard too much about the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, because the intendant or the wardens, any time between sunrise and sunset, they could enter your house to search for bread that did not meet your weight standard. And if you had a bakery, they could search it. And if you had to be really, if you were really ingenious and you hid the bread in the outhouse, they could also search the outhouse. And if they found that the bread was not 1 ounce less than the bread baked in Charleston, you were fined $20. And Dr. Walsh has done a comparison for us. $20 in 1819 would be equal to $370 in 2017 dollars. Sounds a little bit like the fines on Sullivan Island or the dog gets you. Always on Sullivan's Island, concerned about erosion. And there were many measures taken to try to help the beach build up. And they even went to these lengths. They made it illegal to gather what they call beach sage, grass, soil from the front beach. It was illegal to do that because all those were considered to be hindrances that would cause the sand to pile up. And if you did not want to take that risk yourself and you had a slave, if the slave was caught removing any of those illegal items, the slave could be punished up to 20 lashes on his back. And unfortunately, you didn't get off either. You got fined $5, which would be $93 in today's money. Also, a lot of people like to take and drive in their carriages in the afternoon, and all of us who live on the island can appreciate how nice those summer afternoons are on the beach with that famous breeze. And many people would get in their carriages and they would drive up towards the end of the beach, and they wanted to make certain, the authorities, that the path of the carriages was not blocked by debris. If, for example, and this happened frequently, some kind of boat would wash up or some timbers you wanted, you had between high and low tide to get them out of the way so as not to impede the journey of the people in their carriages. And also people were told to avoid certain areas. Down at Station 12, where the grillage is, there were whirlpools. And I remember when I was growing up, they always told the story of somebody who back in the late 1800s had been out driving in their carriage and decided to go through the water and the carriage disappeared. Probably a story, but it made an impression. I guess the thing was to keep us from going swimming at Station 12. It worked. By the way, Stella Maris is about as close as you could get to the heart of Moultrieville. They even had a public market that was established in the area that's behind the church today, towards the back beach. And of course, we've had our share of celebrity. And of course, everybody knows about Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe served here, and he was frequently seen walking up and down the beach. A family named Truesdale had oyster rights. They had an oyster plantation. And one of the Truesdales, who had previously had an oyster bar, I guess you'd call it, on Queen Street, later moved to Sullivan's Island, and he had a little tavern near the back beach. And according to some of the stories, Edgar Allan Poe would drop in there for a drink or two, which I don't find too surprising, because he used a few little lubricants to sort of put him into a certain phase for writing. And we all know about the gold mine, which includes a description of Sullivan's Island. but he also used the scenery here and the legends and the setting for a book he wrote called The Oblong Box. These were written after he was here. And another story called The Balloon Hoax. Now, he also wrote a very famous poem called Annabel Lee. And the story is, Annabel Lee was based on one of the local beauties. There was a family named Ravenel. A lot of planters and merchants would come to spend the summers on Sullivan's Island. And in the Ravenel family was a daughter that supposedly Edgar Allan Poe met. Not too surprising, William Henry Ravenel, who was the famous botanist back in antebellum times, his family came every year. And I think Poe, walking up and down the island, he may have well have met this girl. At any rate, she is supposed to be the subject for Annabel Lee. And in the Unitarian Church in Charleston, there is a graveyard with a tombstone that has the initials ALR. And it is thought that is the tomb of Annabel Lee. By the way, Poe, when he was here, he actually was here as Edgar A. Perry. He had a few other troubles that was kicked out of West Point. But he certainly made a mark on Sullivan's Island and used us in his stories. We have several families on the island that have been here for generations. Michael McInerney arrived here in 1840 from County Clare, Ireland. And the McInerneys are, you can't talk about Sullivan's Island without talking about McInerneys. I mean, I was introduced by a McInerney. Through an oyster shell, you hit a McInerney. They have been very much a part of the life of the community. They have been businessmen. One of the McInerneys operated a lumber mill down there around, not too far from where Hal Cost lives. When I was growing up, the McInerneys had a laundry service. The McInerneys, they're in and out of the story of Sullivan's Island for generations. Everyone, of course, knows about William Tecumseh Sherman, his famous march to the sea from Atlanta, where he burned everything in a path that was 60 miles wide from Atlanta to the sea. He was stationed at Fort Moultrie as a young Army officer from 1842 until 1846. And he was frequently entertained by Colonel Jacob Bond Ion, who enjoyed entertaining the young officers at Fort Moultrie. And I'm sure that Jacob Bond Ion would regale them with the stories when he was in the militia in the War of 1812. Jacob Bond Ion, by the way, is buried at the Ion Development in Mount Pleasant. When he died in downtown Charleston, a barge took his body out to the Ion Development today. And there's a section there at the Ion Development with a pyramid that marks his, an obelisk that marks his resting place. Sherman was very sociable. He loved to hunt, and one of his favorite haunts was to go hunting along the eastern branch of the Cooper River. And he hunted with the family. His son also was an avid hunter. The family they were French Huguenots. Their name was Pius. Some of you are familiar with the Pius Mansion in Charleston at 69 Meeting Street. It's a 3.5-story brick mansion that's located behind the Judicial Center, just below Broad Street. At any rate, on one of these hunting forays, Sherman was thrown from his horse and broke his leg. And the daughter of the family nursed him back to health. Some wag later said they should put up a monument to the horse for throwing Sherman. At any rate, the story doesn't quite end there. In 1865, Sherman was in Columbia, and the daughter of this family, Catherine Paulus, was refugee in Columbia, and the Union soldiers came to loot the house, and she said, "You can't loot this house. I'm a friend of General Sherman's." And the officer said, "Oh yeah, you're right." And she said, "Well, I've got a book to prove it." Well, when Sherman was being nursed back to health at Cedar Hill Plantation on the eastern branch of the Cooper River, he gave her a book of poetry, and he inscribed it. And so apparently this lady thought ahead. She pulled the book out and she turned it and gave it to the officer, and he said, well, that is Uncle Billy's signature. And she said, I'd like to see General Sherman and express my regards. I think she was also trying to save her house. It worked, and he came, and they had a very pleasant conversation. He posted a guard so the property would not be looted. And what is also very important, when he left, he had sent a barrel, 600-pound barrel of rice to this lady who later married Thomas Bennett Lucas, whose family built the West Point rice mill in Charleston. This is the Moultrieville House. This is one of the great resorts on the eastern seaboard in the antebellum period. It was located today, if you leave the fish shack and sort of fly catty-corner to the beach. It was where the beach turns, and so they bragged about the spectacular view they had of the inner harbor, the city of Charleston, and the Atlantic Ocean. What happened was there began to be what they called a stay-at-home movement. In those days, people were afraid of malaria. And on the rice plantations, they would finish planting the rice first part of May. They would flood the fields to a depth of 10 inches approximately with fresh water, and those huge rice fields became gigantic incubators for mosquitoes. And they learned the hard way before the Revolution, if you stayed on those plantations, you could die of malaria. So a lot of these wealthy families went to Newport, Rhode Island, or Saratoga Springs in New York. Another favorite place were the Springs in Virginia. And after the nullification controversy and the growing polarization between North and South, there developed in this area what they called a stay-at-home movement. And they said, why go up there and stay up there with all those Yankees who are charging all these excessive tariffs, and we spend our money up there, we should keep it home. So 82 Charlestonians got together, and they subscribed $32,000 to build this 200-room luxury hotel in 1850. And what is interesting, when the war started, Major Anderson and the federal troops had to evacuate Fort Moultrie, and they went to Fort Sumter. And the second in command to General Anderson was a man named Abner Doubleday. And he was asked later on about his actions, because when he was at Fort Sumter, he took great delight, as he wrote in his book, his memoirs about being here. He said, I aimed 40-pounders at the Moultrieville house. It was at an angle, he said, I shot the shell through one end of the Moultrieville house, and it went completely through the Moultrieville house, and the inhabitants, who were primarily soldiers, fell off of themselves getting out of the building, and someone said, well, you know, Dan, why would you destroy a hotel? I can see you're firing at Fort Moultrie. And his comment was, when I went there, the landlord gave me a wretched room, and I had revenge. So I saw the ultimate revenge, I guess you would say. Again, this is all the building of the Moultrieville house. It was actually really very much a luxury place. When you got off the ferry down at the point, you didn't get on the horse-drawn trolley, but everybody. The Moultrieville house had its own special trolley that took you from the point up to the Moultrieville house. However, though, it really was not that financially successful, and by the end of the war, it was a shell-tone wreck. This shows you some of the fortifications at Fort Moultrie at the beginning of 1861. The island was one gigantic fortified fortress. Battery after battery, all along the front beach. If you see a picture there, you can see how many batteries there were. And of course, up at Breach Inlet, you had Battery Marshall. In addition, you even had floating batteries in the water. They wanted to make sure that the Federals could not get past Sullivan's Island, and it was fulfilling its role for defense purposes. And of course, what's also rather sad, soldiers needed firewood. And Sullivan's Island didn't really have any great forest. And what were you going to do in the winter? Well, you had all these vacant beach houses. And for example, they tore down the mansion of Thomas Pinckney for firewood, and not only his house, but they tore down quite a few other structures. Also, at some point, somebody tried to set the Moultrieville house on fire. They put it out in time. Now later on they had a hotel here that was called the Brighton, and later had it changed its name. It burned in 1925 when some bootleggers were hiding their stash in the myrtle bushes. Couldn't find the stash. It was in January, and they lit a torch to find the stash, and it caught the myrtles on fire. And although the hotel at that time, the Brighton, which had changed its name, was said to be hurricane-proof, it wasn't fireproof. It burned to the ground in January 1925. This is a rather tranquil scene. You see Fort Sumter in the distance. You see the rocks along Sullivan's Island. The government was always putting rocks along the island to fight erosion. Even today, when you go to the Dunes Club, there's a row of houses sort of built over the rocks. And you could have a scene like this. Many times, you know, war is very quiet. And you could have soldiers out there fishing on the rocks, and the next minute, all the cannons could let loose, and it could be a scene of death and destruction. This is not a very good photograph, but it shows you the Federal ironclads that are firing at Fort Sumter, which is a little hard to see. It's right in there, and of course, Fort Moultrie. Fort Moultrie took a beating during the war, and we'll show you some other photographs that shows you what it looked like eventually. This is actually the Sally Port. You see when you look across from the Fort Moultrie Fort Sumter Visitor Information Center, and as you can see, it is in ruins. With all the battering, the shells, the area around Fort Moultrie and along the front beach reminds me a little bit about a picture of the moon. It's just sand and tips and scars. And of course, the grillage always had a habit of catching up ships. Here's a blockade runner called the Celt, 1863. It had about 190 bales of cotton. It was probably trying to slip out of the harbor and head to probably the Bahamas or Bermuda, and it ran up on the rocks, the grillage. And over here to the right, you see the ruins of the Isaiah Smith. Had been a Union vessel the Confederates had captured, and then later it ran aground. So the grillage has always been rather perilous. When I was about 8 years old, some very embarrassed commander in the Navy ran his destroyer into the end of the rocks, Station 12, and it was really an occurrence. People came from miles around, because it took about a week to get the destroyer off the rocks down near Station 12.
The red arrow there, Roy?
Oh yes, thank you. The reason I'm pointing this arrow, it's hard, we'll show you a better picture, but the arrow points towards the first Roman Catholic church on Sullivan's Island. This was St. John the Baptist. Again, it was down near the point, and it is the only structure during the Civil War on Sullivan's Island that did not have its roof damaged, perhaps because it was a church. You can see it has the Gothic-style windows that you see today in the present-day Stella Maris. It was a wooden structure. It was about 3 feet off the ground. It was not very far from where Ann Moore used to live, but very near the back beach. And if you look carefully, you can see the bridge. There was a bridge during the Revolutionary War in case you had to evacuate Fort Sullivan, later became Fort Moultrie. There was a bridge during the Civil War, and I've seen accounts of officers who talk about riding over to Mount Pleasant, which was so green and pleasant and restful after all the sand and fighting on Sullivan's Island. This church had been blessed in 1842, and it was actually in use until 1870s, I think. It was destroyed in what they called a cyclone in 1885. Today we call that a hurricane. But that was the first Roman Catholic church on the island. I think maybe the cross on the roof helped it, you see. Now, the Episcopalians weren't so lucky. They didn't have a cross. They got shelled. After the war, Sullivan's Island had basically 14 shanties. I mean, every house had been battered. But the island bounced back very quickly. Initially, in 1866, the ferries only made irregular stops. People would come over and spend the day, but there was really no place to stay. But those 14 shanties, people immediately started repairing them, and they started building other houses. And here is one of the really great houses built by 1870 by Dr. Patrick. Dr. Patrick, and his house still stands at station 18 and a half. Dr. Patrick was a dentist, but not just any dentist. He had invented dental equipment which was in use in Europe during the 1860s, and by the time the war ended, he was a very, very wealthy man. Most people in Charleston were barely hanging on economically. They used to tell the stories of the people on the battery having their maids go out and fish for mullets for the cats and dogs. The mullet was not for the cats and dogs, it was for the families living in the broken down mansions. This man didn't have to worry about that. This was his summer house. 2.5 stories, built with cypress and with pot pine, and it faced the ocean. You directly overlooked the ocean. There was nothing in front of it at the time. Dr. Patrick, amazing man, he lived in Charleston in the winter at 82 Society Street. The house is still standing. He had 5 sons. All 5 sons were dentists. And he had 5 grandsons. All 5 grandsons were dentists. He also had 3 daughters. And apparently they had some say-so. When he built this summer house, the daughters and his wife insisted he build a separate house, which we know as the octagonal cottage, and in the evening after supper, the men would retreat across to the polka cottage and smoke their cigars and drink whiskey and just have a great time. But they were out of the house, so to speak. Now, 1870s, Sullivan's Island is really recuperating. If you would build a house, you could get a lot. I mean, that was a great come on. And besides, you know, Charleston was a dusty, foul-smelling, congested place, let's face it. All those single houses bumping up one against the other, all those horses. Every house had at least 1 or 2 outdoor privies, and you had people living in the main house and former slaves living in the slave quarters. So if you could get away, you did. In the 1870s, you had a number of clubs. Always people have been very sociable on Sullivan's Island, as we know. Lots of marriages arranged because of, shall we say, escapades. One of our sort of really low-key clubs was the Ankle Club. The Ankle Club was located right close to the ruins of the Moultrieville house. And it belonged to 4 elderly Charleston gentlemen who had a flag that had a big A that they proudly displayed above their house. They were well known because they never went to the ocean. They claimed it was too cold. Lets you know how it is when you get to be old. Your circulation is not that good. they claimed they only went in little gullies where the water was ankle deep. So that's the name, the Ankle Club. Now, the young couples had a very lively club called the Moultrieville Club. And it's not on this slide, but the young bucks, 2018, they had something called the Greeley Club. They had a shack on the back beach up in the Berks where they had some really rowdy parties. But again, it was a very, very sociable place. What is interesting, and I think it's really gives you an idea how, in a way, they got carried away by this prosperity. They decided, why didn't we get some of that money from the Yankees? And a group of locals got together and they made a presentation to a group of wealthy northern investors. And they told the northern investors up in New York, and these people were thinking in big terms. They said in New York, there's a place called Brooklyn, and people go there to get away from the congestion in Manhattan. And we would like to have our own southern version of Brooklyn. It is to be called Seaview City, and it's to cover like 600 acres. I mean, it was bigger than Fort Moultrie. It was to cover that area where the myrtles are. And they even talked back in the 1870s with these northern investors, and apparently these were big talkers here locally. No money, but they could talk big. It was not their money. And they said, you could build a bridge from Charleston, and that would really bring the people over. And things sort of went along just swimmingly until the country had a financial panic, and the northern backers backed out, and Seaview City never got off the drawing boards. But it was quite a utopian idea. Now, in 1876, before the New Brighton Hotel opened in 1884, a very enterprising young man decided that he would build what he called a building to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the United States. It would be called Centennial Hall. And the full name, of course, always thinking of health and a resort, the full name was the Ocean Park Centennial Hall. And this was the brainchild of a man whose name was, he was part of the McInerney, he was the maternal part of the McInerney family. And this Centennial Hall was located where the present-day tennis courts are. And this is where the family lived. This is still there. I think it used to be a fitness center. I think now they're renting bicycles or something. Ice cream, okay. And the young man's name was Anton Hammersmith. And that's the maternal side of the Father McInerney's family. And he ran the Centennial Hall. It actually filled a definite need. You could change to your bathing suits there. For the ladies, they had a beautiful piano. For the men, they had a really first-rate pool table. They could make up a hop in a moment. You could get a meal. It was a thriving place, and not only that, you could get a telephone call from Charleston in 10 minutes. I think the call came in at Fort Moultrie, and somebody got on a bicycle and rode out to Centennial Hall and delivered the phone message. But it worked. And this is more of a Seaview City concept. Again, trying to model this place after Brooklyn, New York, I think the locals got sort of carried away, but in a way sort of laid the basis for later development. Because we did eventually get a trolley line, but it wasn't then, it was not until 1898. This shows you, on the island we have an area called the Mound, and you got the batteries there. Spanish-American War, that set up the red flags in Charleston. Spanish-American War, very controversial. Remember Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders? He wanted to get us into it. President McKinley against us getting into the war. And Roosevelt, very critical. We think we have polarization today. There was a lot of that in the 1890s. Roosevelt, for example, was very critical of McKinley. McKinley had fought in the Civil War, and he said, I have seen the bodies stacked one on top of the other. I do not want war. And Roosevelt's response was, we have to have war, and he's got the backbone of a chocolate eclair. Anyway, they got into the war, and in preparation, because things for Spain were not going well, these batteries were built. And if you look at these batteries, I'm going to point out a couple of things here. It's a little hard to see, but the island has had a number of mansions at one time. This is at the mound looking towards Charleston. That is the dome on the Devereaux Mansion, right there. And then a little bit further down is the dome on that's either the Whitty Mansion or the Mazik Mansion. Again, these were huge mansions that were built in that period, in that prosperous period after the Civil War. This is a house that was removed for battery capitalized. Remember, in 1902, Fort Moultrie expanded from Station 12 to Station 18. Always you had a house here with the understanding you could have it for health reasons, but if it was needed for defense, it had to be sacrificed. So you had an option. You could either move the house, and a local family by the name of Blanchard came to the rescue, and the Blanchards put a number of these houses on the logs, and they rolled them up to different parts of the island. When I was growing up, I had a friend named Richard Blanchard, and their house was one of those houses that had been moved when the fort expanded and rolled up by one of the Blanchards to its location there at Station 22 on the outskirts of the mound. That particular house was there at the end. Now this shows you the building of Battery Jasper, which is not very far from Fort Moultrie, and you will notice, look at those houses that were in front of Battery Gadsden. They either were all moved or they were demolished. So it must have been quite a shock to pick up the paper one day and find out you had an option, either move it or lose it. And most people, I think, just lost them. All those houses have been photographed. This is a picture of the Mazik House, the William Gilliard Mazik House. Down there, it's just outside the walls of Fort Moultrie. It's the second Mazik house on the site. William Gilliard Mazik was a rice planter, started coming to the island in the 1840s. After the war, he built a mansion larger than this, but it was burned to the ground one winter. The Maziks had a falling out with one of the local tradesmen, and I will not give the name, but they favored the tradesman's rival. And the story is, when the Maziks left for the winter, the upset tradesmen set their mansion on fire and burned to the ground. This was the replacement. In itself, a rather handsome house, and I think rather interesting. The Mazik family lived here until, well after World War II, and they took in boarders, because the fort was right across the street. But you had to be an officer. They only took in officers. This was the Whitty Mansion. The Whitty family lived in Charleston. Ashley Hall was their winter home. And actually that picture you saw with the Devereaux Mansion, that was the dome on top of the Whitty Mansion, which burned to the ground. The only building left surviving is this little kitchen building that's behind where Roy Kimball and his family used to live, out in that area. just outside of where the fort ended at Station 18. I should mention something about the Devereaux mansion. You know, Devereaux, and I also want to mention the connection with Stella Maris. You know, after the war, as I mentioned, Fort Moultrieville was in shambles. And the Roman Catholic population on Sullivan's Island was growing. I mean, they were probably the only congregation that also had a good-sized winter congregation. See, most of the Summit people were Episcopalians or Presbyterians. They go back to Charleston. You had a number of Catholic families who went back to Charleston, but you also had a number who stayed here year-round. And after the 1866, Father Birmingham, who was very enterprising, went to General Schofield, a letter I assume. The Schofield barracks are named after in the Hawaiian Islands. And he said, we are going to build a new Catholic church. We've outgrown the old one. And may we use some of the brick rubble for the foundations. Well, I assume General Schofield was finding this is good, what we call today good community relations. He said, well, have at it, in so many words. And so Mr. Devereaux, who was a wealthy contractor, he was an inspector for the government. You know, he built the building down there at the corner of Broad and Meeting Streets where the post office is and the Judicial Center. He built St. Matthew's Lutheran Church in 1872. He and Father Birmingham began gathering up the brick rubble, and they began laying the foundations. And pretty soon they kept eyeing these beautiful bricks that were still part of the original walls, and they thought, wow, wouldn't those look good too? And so they began with great vigor disassembling the walls of Fort Moultrie until the Army found out and put a stop on it. But you have to admire their working for God. This shows you World War I at the fort. The bandstand is now in the park. It was right next to a number of barracks. They're not very far from the Commandant's house. World War II photograph that shows you what Fort Moultrie looked like at the time. Very crowded. People, soldiers everywhere. Even up at Battery Marshall, you had 3,000 people. It was where soldiers who were going to fight in Europe got their orders to disembark to go to Europe. So you had a number of barracks even up at Battery Marshall, and you could see how everything is rather cramped. All these were barracks. I mean, everywhere, practically every square inch of land had something on it except the parade field. And the fort decommissioned in 1947, the end of an era. The fort so intertwined with the history of Moultrieville and later Sullivan's Island. And remember, in 1947, if you had a house over here, you did not have title to the lot. You didn't have fee simple. It still belonged to the state. But that was going to change in the 1960s. And we should mention also, over the years, many, many ferries that came to the island. Most people have heard of the Sprague Carroll. From 1787 until 1821, the Hibbon ferry ran from Mount Pleasant. You had the Commodore Perry. You had the Osiris. Some ferries left Cumberland Street and came directly to Sullivan's Island. Some left Market Street and came to Sullivan's Island. Some went first to Mount Pleasant and then came to Sullivan's Island. But you had a very regular ferry service. Remember, it was an island. We should also mention the trolleys. Hal Cost, by the way, has got all kinds of things. And under his house, he's got one of the beautiful mahogany paneled cut glass windows that was on the trolley. It was a trolley line, but it was mahogany with the cut glass. And the trolley came in 1898 when a man named Lawrence wanted to develop what they call Long Island into a resort. And so he changed the name at that time from Long Island to the Isle of Palms. So that was much more like a resort. That ran for 8 miles, And the power station was down there at Station 9. Today, when you go down to that boat landing, you will see a canal. That was to bring the barges of coal to the power station. And which meant that people on Sullivan's Island had power long before people in the other parts of the country had power. And of course, Fort Moultrieville had power back before the 1900s. Again, on Sullivan's Island, famous for its half-acre lots. The area was noted for its breeze, ocean breeze. And you had these half-acre lots where you have the luxury of space, and the breeze could travel back from several rows. And of course, again, always advertised as a health resort. And when you consider in Charleston, always drawing rooms were on the second story because the first story too smelly. And besides, too much dust. Sullivan's Island, you didn't have those kind of problems. Sullivan's Island government, again, always the land belonged to the state or for use by the federal government. Defense was always a consideration. In 1895, we got a new state constitution, and in the state constitution it said in order to vote you had to be a year-long resident, which meant most of the Charlestonian summertime residents disenfranchised. So a lot of these wealthy Charlestonians didn't even have a vote. People like William F. Byrd. And you had a great division here, not only among the summer residents, but among the winter residents. Some of the Blanchards were in favor of the Charleston residents, some weren't. Some of the Macedons were, some weren't. They divided families. The solicitor for Sullivan's Island was a man named William St. Julian Jervin, and he did not want anything changed. And eventually, you had what they call the taxpayer revolt. A lot of these summer residents said, we pay taxes, but we have no vote. And they complained about the fact that there was nepotism over here. They complained that there were some people up near Station 22 that their outdoor privies were too close to where they got their drinking water. And this is William F. Byrd. This is wealthy Charleston man who owned William F. Byrd and Company. And he was very upset that he did not have a vote. So you had a group from Sullivan's Island. It was called the Sullivan's Island Storm. It was composed not only of summer residents, but year-round residents in some cases. Theodore Blanchard was one of them, and they went up to Columbia to present their case, and they shot down the arguments of the Sullivan's Island town solicitor. And as a result of that, the township had its charter revoked in 1906, and you had a township form of government created, and you had 2 members appointed by the state and 3 elected by the people. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in 1968, property could be owned in fee simple for the first time since the very earliest days. And by the way, when you ride over Sham Creek, just remember, tell those Mount Pleasant people, that was called Sullivan's Island Creek originally, because it belonged to Florence O'Sullivan, who got a land grant for the whole area. So it wasn't until after he died and somebody else came along and put their name on it. But when you ride over Sham Creek, got the right S, but get the wrong name as far as we're concerned. Now, 1975, the property owners decided to form a town. They were a little bit threatened by Charleston, and they felt they needed a town of Sullivan's Island. So in 1975, you have the town of Sullivan's Island formed with a mayor and a town council. And the first mayor was Wilfred Lippman. Lippman came from a family that was very much in public service. His father had been the mayor of Barno Beach. He was of Jewish descent. A number of Jewish families in Charleston first had stores up there around Barno Beach. And then later, like the Dumases, moved into downtown Charleston. His great uncle was Rittenberg. Most of us know about Sam Rittenberg Boulevard. He came from a family of public service, and Lippman became the first mayor. He very much wanted it to be a family beach. He was controversial, very outspoken. His enemies called him Wilford the Lip, because he didn't mind speaking his mind. He was not a politician who hid his feelings. And he said he didn't want any restroom facilities over here. He wanted people just to come, go to the beach, and go home. There he is. First mayor. He was the first honor graduate at Clemson. And he actually has the distinction of being the first of our mayors of what we call the town of Sullivan Island. Lived up at station 23. Oh, the town seal. Oh, how controversial. You would think selecting something like a town seal would be pretty humdrum. Not on Sullivan's Island. We have frequently had our tempests. Hurricanes aren't the only time people get upset. The town had a contest, and the contest was to select a suitable seal for the town of Sullivan's Island. And the participants were told that the seal would be the property of Sullivan's Island, and none of the original entries would be returned. Well, a lady who taught art at the Gibbs Art Gallery had the winning entry. And she thought, oh, how wonderful. That is until they printed the copy of the town seal. They had changed her design. She was not happy. She called it a plagiaristic abortion. She said she was very upset over Sergeant Jasper. She said, I had him with his hair blowing in the breeze. What is wrong with having a head of hair? She said instead they put a stupid little cap on his head. They made him hollow-chested, pot-bellied, and turned him into a goon. Originally, she had houses, different houses on Sullivan's Island, and the committee that Ray Fetter was charged, Ray Fetter headed the committee along with William Riley, and they decided they should insert, instead of houses, Fort Sumter. And she said, what is Fort Sumter doing on the town seal of Sullivan's Island? And Mayor Lippman replied, we have been pounded by Fort Sumter over the years, and you can't separate Fort Sumter from Sullivan's Island. She said, I will not be a party to glorifying war, and I want Fort Sumter removed. And she said, furthermore, what are these nasty little weeds down there? And Ray Feller said, we call them sea oats. And they serve a very valuable purpose, those so many words. And she said, nasty little weeds, and they clutter up the purity of my design. And I insist that you take all this clutter out and return my original design to me and make copies of my original design. And the committee said, the rules are that no original designs will be returned. And so we have her design with some additions by the town committee. So Miss Vaughn was not too pleased. Again, you know, our iconic lighthouse has always been controversial with some people. I think the color got changed somewhere along the way. And again, showing you the beginnings of what's to come. I thank you very much.